In this lesson, I want to talk about grammar. We've already had a couple lessons on grammar. Recall referential phrasing, recall comparative claims. Here I want to talk more about grammar. This is a super important topic on the test. You've already seen that the sentence structure present in logical reasoning isn't simple. It's not like your average day-to-day colloquial, like have a conversation kind of language. It's not. It's far denser than that. So grammar is where people get lost. I briefly touched upon logic also in an earlier lesson, and we'll cover more logic in later lessons. Logic is also a territory where the LSAT writers lose students, but so is grammar. Okay, this is such an important part. I absolutely cannot stress this enough. Grammar is so important, so fundamental to your ability to do well on this test. You have to learn to deconstruct complex grammar, strip away what's unnecessary, so that you can see to the core of a sentence, and then from that kernel, build back up to the level of complexity. And that should ring a bell, because that is something that you've already seen me do in earlier lessons. But here, I want to take a theoretical perspective. I want to do this step by step, and I want to introduce two new concepts of grammar. And these terms are, one is modifiers, the other is embedded clauses, embedded or nested clauses. And just as a caveat, these terms are terms that I made up myself. I think they get the job done. They're definitely oversimplifications, just like how in logic, I mentioned the first few weeks of a college level logic class is probably enough to cover what's on the LSAT. Same with grammar. It does get complicated, but not nearly as complicated as if you were to, study linguistics and actually do a deep dive on grammar. So these terms, while they are oversimplifications, get the job done. So best way to understand what they are is just to look at an example, a sentence. Cats can develop affection towards people. Pretty straightforward, simple from a grammar perspective, the sentence, right? You begin your analysis with what's the subject, right? What's the noun, in other words? What's the thing about which the sentence is trying to say something? And it's cats. The sentence is trying to say something about cats. What's the action? Are the cats doing something, or are we saying something about the cats? Here, we're saying something about the cats, right? The action is that cats have this potential, right? They have this potential to develop affection towards people. That's the predicate. This is the subject. At the basic level, you're going to have to do this for sentences. Identify what the subject is, identify what the main action verb is, right? I suppose here is not really even action, just the verb, right? What's happening to the subject. You have to do that because that's the simplest version of a sentence. It has a subject and a predicate. Right? Without either one, you really don't have a sentence. This is the kind of stuff that they add on to complicate that simple grammar. Starting with modifiers. You can think of modifiers just adjectives, right? Like, notice this sentence is about cats. It didn't say what kind of cats. It just says cats can develop affection. So, meaning, like, the sentence is just making a claim about the entire set of cats, right? All the cats in the world. Right? Each one exists as a dot, as a member in this class, in this set. The sentence is just saying, of all of those cats, what about you? Well, there's a potential to develop affection towards people. Now, as soon as you add a modifier, right, let's do that. Let's say big cats. So here it's just a simple adjective, big. Big is describing cats, right? So that's an example of a modifier. It's not the only kind of modifier, but it surely is one example of modifier. As soon as I do that, what have I done? I've taken my set of cats, and now instead of the sentence making a claim over the entire set, now I'm saying, well, just identify wherever the big subset is. Maybe the big subset is over here. You guys are the big cats. Now all of a sudden, the sentence is just talking about these cats. These cats can what? Can develop affection towards people, right? That's just a simple example of what a modifier is. Modifiers can modify nouns. They can also modify not nouns. Generally speaking, when they are modifying nouns, we call them adjectives, but they can modify verbs as well. And we call those adverbs, right? Cats can develop affection. Okay, I could have complicated this by saying cats can quickly develop affection, right? So now this word quickly is modifying the manner in which it develops affection. So that's a modifier as well. Towards people. Notice I didn't say what kinds of people. I could have said towards people who, which, that, are, all of these things, are affectionate towards cats. Again, contrast this version of the sentence versus the initial simpler version of the sentence. In the first version of the sentence, we're just saying cats can develop affection towards people, like unmodified, just people, the entire set. Like, yeah, anybody in here, cats potentially can develop affection towards you. Now I've modified people. You see, the way I modified people, this is a much more complex modifier. I use the language of who are affectionate towards cats. I use the language of people which are affectionate towards cats. I use the language of people that are affectionate towards cats. All of the three different ways are just, different ways of saying, more or less the same way of saying what kind of people we're talking about. When I'm looking at this set, I'm carving out a subset of people, the subset who are affectionate towards cats. That's you guys, right? You guys are the ones that are affectionate towards cats. I'm saying cats can develop affection towards you guys. I'm not saying anything about you out here. I'm only saying something about you in here. So do you see, you can use, a phrase, a clause, right? A clause can act as a modifier as well. So you can start to see that this is, with all of these different ways of blowing up something that's relatively simple, you can see that the LSAT writers have a lot of tools at their disposal to make a sentence convoluted. All right, so for the rest of this lesson, let's practice building up. Let's consider this sentence. Dogs are more easily trained when the trainer uses A rather than B. Hopefully the presence of this word than registered on your radar, right? Hopefully it triggered your memory of an earlier grammar lesson on comparative statements. That's what the sentence is. It's a comparative statement. And as far as comparative statement goes, this is not a super convoluted comparative statement. Let's recall what we do for comparative statements. We establish the two things that we're comparing, and then we establish what we're comparing them on, and then we declare a quote-unquote winner. Two things, okay, let's back up even one more step. The subject is dogs, right? We're talking about dogs. And what are we saying about dogs? We're saying, well, they're more easily trained when a trainer uses A compared to how easily trained they are when the trainer uses B, right? So on the one hand, we're talking about the training regiment called A. On the other hand, we're talking about the training regiment called B, and I intentionally, obviously, you can kind of already see the seeds of making this more convoluted, right? We can unpack this box. What is in the A box? What are you hiding in there? Nothing good. So let's not open the box yet. Let's just consider the A box versus the B box, the A training regiment versus the B training regiment. What are we comparing these two training regiments on? We're comparing them on which one has higher success, right? Which one's more easy to implement, right? Which one will result in a more easily trained dog. That's the comparison of which one is the winner. A is the winner, right? A is the winner here. That's what this sentence is saying. Talking about a dog, you compare training regimen A against training regimen B. You compare them on which one will result in a more easily trained dog. It's training regimen A. Okay, good. Let's complicate this, right? Let's complicate this by adding some modifiers, maybe adding some embedded clauses, some clauses, and maybe even embedded clauses. So immediately you probably notice that I opened up the box, right? Here's the A box opened up. Here's the B box opened up. Dogs are more easily trained when the trainer uses both positive and negative reinforcement techniques rather than exclusively one of those techniques. Right? Not only did I open up the box, I introduced also referential phrasing, one of those techniques, either compared to either positive or negative. So really, this comparison is a three-way comparison. The A version is where the trainer uses both positive and negative enforcement techniques, compared against B1, where the trainer uses only positive reinforcement techniques, and also compared against B2, where the trainer uses only negative reinforcement techniques. And we're saying A wins over both of them. The dog is more easily trained when you do this than when you do this, and the dog is more easily trained when you do this than when you do just this. Okay, so this one, having established already what the comparative structure of the sentence is, I think this one was fairly straightforward. Right here, we just opened up the box and, saw what was inside. The complexity that this sentence has over this sentence is achieved through using modifiers, right? When the trainer uses, I could have just said technique A, but I didn't. I said, what technique? This positive and negative reinforcement technique Compared against what? Compared against some other technique. What's the some other technique? Exactly one of those techniques alone, right? So these are modifiers of the kind of techniques that we're talking about, right? That's how the LSAT writers will complicate sentences. Okay, let's keep going. What's different about this sentence? Dogs are more easily trained to develop a protective attitude when the trainer uses both positive and negative reinforcement techniques rather than exclusively one of those techniques. See, now we are adding a clause to further flesh out the details of what are we training them for? Like, what's the goal? What's the aim of this training? We know, A results more easily in achieving this training goal than B does, but what is the training goal? That's what this clause reveals to us. Oh, now we know we're training dogs to be protective, right? To have a protective attitude. And of course, the rest of it is still the same. We have, here's the A technique compared against the B technique over here, right? And still, of course, A wins. And just when you thought this couldn't get any more complicated, it does. Not by much, right? But it does, right? Dogs are more easily trained to this aim to develop protective attitude toward humans, right? Toward humans. Now we have explicitly stated protective attitude towards what? Towards humans, right? So more details come out of this. And of course, the rest of this stays the same, A versus B. And you guessed it, we can keep going. I mean, at this point, you might as well assume that this never stops. It just keeps getting more and more complicated. This time, you see, we introduce another clause which describes the kind of humans we're talking about, right? We learned that we're getting the dog to develop a protective attitude towards humans, what, all humans, or any specific kinds of specific humans, right? Here, this addition answers the question. It's specific humans. We're getting the dogs to develop protective attitudes towards humans about which those dogs, referential phrasing, originally were indifferent, right? It's like the humans that the dogs weren't already protective towards, right? It's like these humans that the dogs originally, like, I couldn't care less if you lived or died. It's those humans that we're getting the dogs to change their attitude towards. We're getting them to say, well, okay, now I actually care, I want to protect you. So you see, this clause here modifies the kinds of humans that we're talking about. And once again, the rest of the sentence stays the same. We're still comparing this training technique against this training technique and which one achieves. You see how the goal now, like, let's just review for a second how far we've come. You see how, like, in the very first version, we knew so little about the goal, right? Detail. That's what convoluted grammar achieves. It packs in a lot of detail. Initially, you had no idea what we were training the dog for. Just like, wow, okay, train dogs. Yeah, that makes sense. We train dogs. Toward what end? Don't know. Using what techniques? Don't know. Each iteration that complicates the sentence more than the previous iteration also reveals more details. Okay, and let's keep going. I know this feels like torture, but this is exactly the kind of thing you're going to get on the LSAT. I am not kidding. It does get this complicated and more so. Okay, like, thankfully not every single question, but some of the hardest questions have grammar in excess of this level of complexity, right? So we add another layer. Everything stays the same. This time, we add a clause that reveals when these techniques, these training techniques, are being used, right? Dogs are more easily trained to develop a protective attitude toward humans about which they originally are indifferent when the trainer uses both positive and negative reinforcement techniques rather than exclusively one of those techniques during tactical obedience exercises, right? So finally, this last bit of information tells you, yeah, when, when are the trainers using technique A versus technique B? Oh, okay, during tactical obedience exercises. Last bit of detail, last bit of information that's revealed by this clause. Okay, so look how far we've come. You strip this convoluted sentence of all of its details, and it just kind of boils down to something like this. Dogs are more easily trained when trainer uses A rather than B, right? And you're losing a lot of information. You're losing information about what the purpose of the training is for, right? Be protective of people. All people? No. Specifically, people towards which those dogs were initially indifferent, right? You lose information here in this version about just what A means. What is A? What technique is A, right? You lose that information. In subsequent iterations, you get that information. And you also lose information about when these techniques are being implemented. And that's information you only get in the last sentence. But you know what? It's your ability, like the point of going through this exercise from progressively simple to more complex is that you have to be able to carve up grammatically convoluted sentences like this into its constituent parts and just build them up, right? So now let's practice. Let's do this backwards, because on the LSAT, you're not going to get a sentence like this. You're going to get a sentence like this. So now I want to see if given a sentence like this, if you can progressively simplify it, right, to its basic version so that you understand at its core what the sentence is saying, before then adding back all the details to get to a complete, robust understanding of the full sentence. Okay, so let's take a look at this sentence, which says professional chefs who have achieved mastery over their cuisines are more inclined to embrace an entirely different style of cooking if they, while still young and impressionable, are repeatedly exposed to it under the guidance of a true master of that style. Yeah, that's a complicated sentence, right? Now, the first thing you want to do before you start to simplify it is to make cuts in the sentence. And by that, I mean, notice I formatted this in a way that made it easier to read, right? That's what I mean by making cuts, line breaks. And you'll get better as you do this more and more, obviously, but the way you do it is you start by identifying what the subject is. What are we talking about? We're talking about chefs, right? You start to see like, okay, chefs, that's the main noun. But are we talking about every single chef in the world? No, right? We're modifying the chefs. First of all, we're only talking about the professional chefs. Okay, great. So that set of chefs gets immediately cut down to just the professional ones. Are we talking about all professional chefs? No. We're talking about a further subset. We're talking about professional chefs who have achieved mastery over their cuisine. That's an even smaller subset. That's like this subset over here now, right? Not all professional chefs have achieved mastery over their cuisine. Do you see? So this is how you start to cut down the sentence, to break the sentence up. Okay, so the who have achieved mastery over their cuisine, that modifies the chefs. So I'm going to cut that part out. And that finishes the subject analysis. Because I see this verb, are, right? We're trying to say something about professional chefs. They are something. What? What are they? They're more inclined to embrace something, right? If this part becomes kind of hard to cut because I want to cut right here in between the two commas, but I also notice that the commas are doing something really annoying, which is that the commas are separating out an embedded clause which has its own subject and predicate structure. They are repeatedly exposed to it under the guidance of a true master of that style. That's a complete sentence in and of itself. Like you can just take the sentence, they are repeatedly exposed to it under the guidance of a true master of that style, fully complete sentence with a subject predicate on its own. It's embedded as a clause in a larger sentence with a subject predicate that engulfs the smaller one, right? So there's this nesting nature of grammar that makes it, well, that just makes it hard. Okay, so I've already done the cutting, so let me just show you what that looks like. By the way, this is not like the only way to do it, but this is one way to do it, right? Professional chefs, and here notice I cut out this part because it just modifies the chefs, are more inclined to embrace something, right? If something is the case. You see, like, I'm just kind of saying chefs are more inclined to embrace something if this is the case. Now, there is a reason why I made these cuts over here, and I'll get to that, but first let's just simplify. Having made the cuts, let's simplify a bit. Going one layer up, we're going to delete professional, right? We're going to delete who have achieved mastery over their cuisine. So now it becomes a simpler version, just chefs, unmodified chefs. The rest of it stays the same, are more inclined to blah, 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 blah. Let's keep going. In this version, notice I got rid of this adverb, I think, but that describes different, like it's not just a little bit different, it's entirely different, right? So I'm like, okay, well, that's just added details. Let's get rid of it for now, right? And style, what? Style of dress, right? Style of architecture, no, style of cooking. So I'm getting rid of that as well, right? To just kind of simplify it. If they, and again, this is just setting out an additional limitation, right? It's not saying like, oh, at any time if they are repeatedly exposed to it under the guidance. No. It has to happen when they're young and impressionable, right? While they're young and impressionable. So I'm getting rid of that as well. With these deletions, we get to a much more simplified version, but of course we can keep going, and you end up with something like this. Chefs are more inclined to A. I just took all of this stuff and packed it into A. If they are B. And I took all of this stuff and just packed it into B. So really, this sentence turns out to be a comparative sentence. Did you notice that? Like, honestly, did you notice that when you were getting bombarded with all the details over here, right? Probably some of you did notice that, are more inclined. It's comparative, not explicitly like this sentence was comparative, right? This one just has, like I said, sentences using the word than are like declaring themselves to be explicitly comparative. But we've already seen in one of the logical reasoning questions that you can implicitly declare a comparison as well. And here we're doing that. What are we comparing? We're comparing chefs that are B versus what? It's implied that we're saying chefs are more inclined to A if they are B than if not B. This is the part that's not stated but implied, right? We're saying chefs are more inclined to A if they are B than if they are not B. That's the comparison. Chefs not B. What are we comparing them on? Which one is more inclined to A? That's the point of comparison. And which one is more inclined to A, the B ones or the not B ones? Well, it just says are more inclined if they are B. So this is the quote unquote winner, right? So now we can add back in the details. Now that we've revealed the core structure of what this comparative statement is, let's go ahead and add back in the details. What is this A? What are we talking about? Inclined to what? They are more inclined to embrace a different style. Okay, so who's like more open-minded, in other words? Like, I'm of this style, right? This is a completely new style, but I'm more willing to embrace that style. That's what we're comparing on. Okay, great. What's the B? The B is if they are repeatedly exposed to it under the guidance of a true master of that style. Okay, that kind of makes sense, right? Like you have in this version, we have a master of that other style that under whose guidance our chef is repeatedly exposed to this new style. So it makes sense that this chef will be more inclined to embrace that style compared to some other chef who wasn't repeatedly exposed under the guidance of a true master, right? So it makes sense. But there's more details to be added in, right? Entirely, well, we already talked about that. Additional detail that we lost here was that this exposure, this B, contains details of that exposure. It has to happen when the chefs are young and impressionable, compared against if the chefs are, say, old and no longer and set in their ways, right? I suppose that would be the contrast. So as you see, there's more detail in the comparison. Over here, we have under the guidance of a true master. Here we have not under the guidance of a true master. Here we have repeatedly. Here we have not repeatedly. And then in this version, we have also, while they're young and impressionable, here implicitly it's they're old and set in their ways already. And then finally, the last bit, this is probably the easiest bit to add back in, which is these are descriptions of what kind of chefs we're talking about, right? Versus this is saying the kind of treatment or experience they're undergoing. Here we're talking about not just all chefs, we're talking about professional chefs who've already achieved mastery over their own cuisine. Okay, so that was a lot, right? That was quite intense. But the silver lining here is that I really didn't pull any punches. I'm not going to say this is like the hardest it's going to get on the test, because the test always has this wonderful way of surprising you with how difficult it can be. But I will say that this is about as hard as it gets on the test, right? So I didn't like, in a sense, I did expose like slightly easier versions, but ultimately I did build up to what I thought was either at the ceiling or towards the ceiling of difficulty in terms of grammar. Okay, so I suggest you try to use these two different versions as templates to come up with your own exercises, right? Nothing reinforces a lesson better, right? Reinforces concepts better than trying to build your own problems and answer them.